Hello, welcome back. Today we want to continue our discussion of Congress, its main function, and the people that are included in it. So a couple of things to keep in mind before we get started today. Congress is the legislative branch. It includes the House of Representatives and the Senate, and their main job is to make law. Okay? So the House of Representatives. Some numbers just to help jog your memory. There are 435 representatives in the House, and Missouri sends 8 representatives to Washington, D.C. To kind of fill our part in the House of Representatives. All right. So getting to it today. The function of the House of Representatives, as well as the function of the Senate, is to make laws. Okay, they have other responsibilities as well, but that is like their number one responsibility, is to make laws. The rules in the House of Representatives. We have rules and procedures for what we do every day. You have certain things that you're supposed to do when you come into a classroom. There are certain things that you're supposed to do when you go to an athletic practice or a band practice or a choir practice. There's protocol that you follow, and that's the same thing in the House. The rules in the House of Representatives are based on precedent, and precedent was one of your vocabulary words, and that basically just means that it's an example or a guideline upon which future decisions or rules are based. And the rules in the House of Representatives are also very strict and in comparison to the Senate. And the main reason for that is because there are just so many people in the House of Representatives that if you didn't have a really strict set of guidelines, then you're really not going to get much done. So if you had 435 congressmen jumping up and down and blurting out ideas and discussions, and I mean, you're just not going to get anything done. So in order for things to go smoothly and somewhat efficiently, there's a certain set of procedures and rules that have to be followed. Now, leadership. In the House of Representatives right now, the Republicans have the majority. And that basically means that there are more Republican representatives in the House of Representatives right now than there are Democrats. So because of that, the Republicans have control, and since they have control, they are able to choose the Speaker of the House. Okay. Now, the Speaker of the House is third in line for the presidency, and we'll reference the line of succession later on. But if something were to happen to the president and the vice president, the Speaker of the House would be left to take charge in our country. So the Speaker of the House right now is John Boehner. Now, John Boehner is a Republican. That's what the R after his name means. He's a Republican from Ohio. And as Speaker of the House, John Boehner was elected by the majority party, which is the Republicans. And his main job is to preside over the House of Representatives. And that basically means he's in charge of it. He's like the president of the House of Representatives. So he's responsible for calling sessions of the House into order. There are certain situations in which he would actually vote on a piece of legislation, but he typically doesn't do that. So he's just basically in charge. Just think of it like that. Now, you also have in the House of Representatives a majority leader and a minority leader. Now, again, because the Republicans have the majority in the House, the majority leader is going to be a Republican, and that person is Kevin McCarthy. Okay, he is the majority leader of the House of Representatives. And his main job as majority leader is to try to make sure that any bills that his party wants to address are brought to the floor for discussion or for debate. So his job is to push his party's bills through the House. Then we've got the minority leader, and the minority leader is Nancy Pelosi. And since the Democratic Party is the minority party in the House, the minority leader is a Democrat. Okay? Her job is basically to do the same thing as the majority leader, but to do so for her party. So her job is to push the Democratic Party bills through the House of Representatives. Now, her job is probably a little trickier than Kevin McCarthy's because there's not as many Democrats as there are Republicans. So it's going to be trickier to get your agenda passed. We also have minority whips and majority whips. Now, the whips are kind of fun to talk about. A whip in the House of Representatives and also in the Senate is it gets its name from whipping up votes. Okay, this person doesn't walk around with an actual whip and like beat people to make sure that they vote the same way. But their main job is to go around and to encourage members from their party to make sure that they're present on certain bills. And to make sure that members of their party are educated on bills and know that their party's got a really important bill coming up for debate, so you better be there and you better show support. Okay? So the minority whip is Steny Hoyer, and since we're talking about the minority party in the House, we're talking about the Democrats. And the majority whip is Steve Scalise, and he is the Republican majority whip. Okay? Next, we have committees in the House of Representatives. Now, committees, they're basically a small group of congressmen who work together to accomplish a task. Okay? We have committees in school. We have clubs. We have different organizations that are small groups of students or small groups of teachers that work together to accomplish a task. And that's exactly what committees do in Congress. Now, there are tons of committees in the House of Representatives, and they're extremely important in the House. And the reason for that, we can kind of say, as we already discussed it up here, you got to have a lot of committees because you can't have 435 congressmen working on individual bills. They're going to have to work together. They're going to have to work together to make sure that things are as efficient as possible. Okay? The most important committee in the House of Representatives is the Rules Committee. Okay? Now, in order for, let's say that I'm a Republican congressman, and I have a great idea for a bill. And before my idea for a bill can get discussed on the House of Representatives floor, the Rules Committee has to say that that's okay. So since the Republicans are in control of the House of Representatives, and I said I was a Republican congressman, my bill is probably going to get pushed through a little quicker than a Democratic congressman would have. Okay? The Rules Committee is also led by the majority party. So right now the Republicans, since they're the majority, are in control of the Rules Committee. And the Rules Committee is often called the traffic officer of the House because, like, if you can think about whenever traffic lights go out at an intersection, there's a traffic officer, a cop standing there saying, okay, you need to stop and you can keep going and etc., directing traffic. And that's basically what the Rules Committee does. They direct the flow of legislation in the House. Okay? Make sure that if you need to, you're pausing me, you're rewinding me, and jotting the stuff down as we go. All right, so now we want to go to the lawmaking process in the House. And I know you guys have all seen that Schoolhouse Rock video, I'm Just a Bill, sitting on Capitol Hill. I want you to kind of think back to that for me as we start discussing the lawmaking process in the House. Okay? So, step one, of course, is to introduce the bill. Now, a bill can only be introduced by a member of the House of Representatives. That seems kind of obvious. You're not just going to have somebody off the street walk into the House of Representatives and say, hey, I've got a great idea. Let's talk about this. Okay? So that's the first step. When bills in the House are proposed, they are placed in the hopper by a representative. Okay? And I'm going to show you a picture of the hopper in just a minute. But the hopper is basically a large wooden box, and that's where they put their bill. Okay? Now, why do they do that? It's just tradition. It's a precedent, to use a vocabulary word. Step two is committee action. So once the bill is placed in the hopper, the Speaker of the House takes it out, and he is responsible for distributing it to committees. Okay? So if you have a bill that is dealing with, I don't know, getting rid of standardized tests for students, I know you'd all be in favor of that. So if we had a bill that was aimed at doing that, you would most likely, as the Speaker, give that bill to, I don't know, the Committee on Education, because those people are supposedly going to have some expertise and have a little bit of background knowledge about the content of that bill. So they're going to have the best examples, the best guidelines to go off of. And in committees, the congressmen discuss and vote on the bills. And if a bill doesn't make it out of committees, like if not enough people vote in favor of passing the bill on, then sometimes the bill is just stuck. Sometimes it just dies there in the committees. Step three is posting the bills on a calendar. Okay, so any bill that survives the committee process, they're placed on one of 5 calendars. And I think this was one of the questions that you guys had in assignment 2, so hopefully this will help clear that up. There are 5 calendars in the House of Representatives. You have the Union calendar, the House calendar, the private calendar, the consent calendar, and the discharge calendar. Okay? Now, most of the bills that we have that are heard in the House of Representatives are going to go on the Union calendar. And that's because bills that deal with money go on the Union calendar. And as you can imagine, most of the time, any bill proposed in the House is going to deal with money. Okay? The House calendar includes other public bills, which is probably a very small number. The private calendar would include bills that deal with an individual person or place. So if we wanted to propose a bill that was going to increase the taste of water in Park Hills, Missouri, that would go on the private calendar because it only affects a small group of people. You also have the consent calendar, which includes bills that have unanimous consent from the committee. And if a bill comes out with unanimous consent, that really says something because the people that are serving on these committees are supposed to be experts. So if they think a bill is good enough and all of them agree on that, that doesn't happen very often. But I mean, that really is a powerful statement for a bill to be put on the consent calendar. And then the last calendar could be the discharge calendar. And sometimes you may not have the consent of the committee chairperson. And if that happens, it goes on the discharge calendar. Okay? And last but not least is discussion. So after the bill goes through all of these different steps, it can finally be discussed on the House floor. Okay? That discussion, most of the time, isn't really long because most of the discussion has already happened in the committee action. Okay? So, as promised, here is a picture of the hopper. Isn't it beautiful? The large wooden box. Okay, so there's your information on the House of Representatives. We will wait to move on to the Senate for another video. So make sure that you have taken notes on your Google Doc and you are also answering the embedded questions in Ed Puzzle. So if you guys have any questions, ask me in class. Bye.